Have you ever wondered why two brewers might use exactly the same malt and exactly the same hops, but end up with completely different beers?
Well, yes, that could be everything to do with the yeast. We're back with another Homebrewing 101 on ingredients, but this time we are focusing on yeast.
That's right, Rob. We're going to be taking a look at the differences between liquid and dry yeast, ale versus lager yeast, some of the weird and wonderful yeasts that are out there as well, all with a view to helping you folks learn as much as possible about this actually unsung hero in many cases of homebrewing and wider beer brewing.
So James, let's start off with the very basics. What actually is yeast?
Yeast is a single-celled fungus, okay? Yeast can be found in loads and loads of different formats all around the world in many different environments. In fact, there's probably a million different yeast varieties just within a few meters of us right now. But the two we're really interested in and that we're going to focus on for the majority of this video are the yeast that we use to make ales, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and the yeast which is used to make lagers, which is Saccharomyces pastorianus.
Nice one, James. Yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah. Now there are other yeasts and bugs that are used within brewing, but broadly speaking, those are the two most common yeast strains that are used for brewing beer. Within that, though, there are many different species of those particular yeast categories, I think is probably the best way to term it.
Their role within beer making is to convert the sugar that we've created during the mash, to convert that sugar into carbon dioxide, which blows off, and alcohol that we enjoy to drink.
As well as the things that you've just mentioned there, Rob, they can also produce flavour compounds, okay, which we can experience and pick up through sensory analysis within beer. So things like esters, so aromas, which are specifically generated by the yeasts. Some flavours as well that can be generated by the yeasts. Yeasts can also act in a way where they interact with the other ingredients that are in the wort to create, new and wonderful flavours through things like biotransformation or thiol unlocking, but that's probably a separate topic altogether, right? They can also produce things like phenols and fusel alcohol, which we can pick up when we're drinking a beer, and it's generated through that fermentation process.
Yeah, now some of these things, these byproducts, we can call them, are desirable in beer. Some of them are desirable in certain styles of beer and not in others, but we'll take a look at that a little bit further on.
Now, yeast for brewing, whether it's home brewing or commercial brewing, tends to be available in two formats, right, Rob?
Yeah, so we're looking at either a liquid, a direct pitchable liquid that goes into your fermenter, or literally it's a powder that we can either rehydrate and put into the fermenter or just sprinkle on top of the wort.
Now, you mentioned there about rehydration of dry yeast. Now, generally, that isn't something that's required for most dry yeasts that are available now on the market, right?
Yeah, sure, and actually the advice on this has changed relatively recently. They used to be an option on the yeast packets that used to say either direct pitch the dry product or give you steps on how to rehydrate. Actually, the more current way of thinking is there's more risk involved with the rehydration process through contamination, so it kind of negates any benefits of rehydration. And actually, it's always really been my method to just directly pitch dry yeast.
And the drying processes that the yeast manufacturers have improved massively.
Yeah.
So there's more viable, so living yeast cells within those dried products than there was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Now, liquid yeast, this is an interesting one. So until fairly recently, we've talked about this quite a bit on the channel, until fairly recently, liquid yeast was the go-to if you needed very specific strains or you wanted something, a little bit out there, right? And that is still the case. But dry yeast has exploded in terms of its availability, right?
Yeah, this has been a massive improvement and a massive benefit to home brewers wanting to brew many different styles of beer. There's another thing in there, James, that really needs picking up, and that is on a cost basis as well. So it used to be, if you're brewing certain styles of beer, you could only use liquid yeast, and that started to push up the cost, and actually further into the cost. The cost of liquid yeast has accelerated quicker than the cost of dry yeast. So now the cost difference between the two is really greater than it's ever been before. That's really as an aside to what we're speaking about today.
I mean, there is still a wider variety of strains available within liquid, whilst dry has increased significantly over the last few years. So if you do want, say for example, a specific brewery strain, you may well be able to find that within the liquid range, but it's not available in the dry range. Liquid yeasts, they are alive within the packet, okay? When they are produced, they are alive. As they go throughout their shelf life, the yeast cells within the packet start to die off. So we call this viability, how much viable yeast cells are within that liquid pouch. And most of the providers of these liquid yeasts tell you over a certain amount of time from when it was manufactured, you can expect the yeast viability to be this, this or this, depending on how far away it was from manufacture. Within dry yeast, the shelf life is significantly longer because of that, also because it's dry, and liquid yeast has to be kept cold.
It's a much more fragile product than dry yeast.
Yeah, and it also used to be the case, Rob, with most of the liquid yeast strains that you would need to create a starter because there was X amount of billion cells in the pouch. Let's say it's the freshest of the fresh, you know, there's very little that is not viable. But if you needed a pitchable amount for your batch, you would still need to create a starter.
Yeah.
A lot of the liquid yeast suppliers now have increased the amount of overall cells that are in the pouches, which means that is less of a need. But there is also a consideration where you may need to still create a yeast starter. We've got videos on that. I'll put some links above Rob's head on how to create yeast starters. But there might be times when you need to still create a yeast starter if it's a bit further down the line from its manufacturing date, for example. You've got a bigger batch size.
Higher gravity beers.
Yeah.
There's another thing to be taken into account here as well. So a lot of, in fact, almost all of the liquid yeast suppliers are US based, and they're directly pitchable into 5 US gallons rather than 5 UK gallons.
So the key takeaway from this particular point really is, you know, have a look at first of all, the beer style you're trying to brew. Then have a look at both liquid and dry yeasts to see whether there is a yeast that will fit your needs, and then choose appropriately. And if you want to experiment and try some slightly different yeast strains within the same recipe, then take a look at the liquid yeasts. Just bear in mind the things that we have touched upon here.
The very last thing I want to do is sound anything negative about liquid yeast, because there are some amazing strains, and there's some amazing strains that you can only get that are in liquid yeast. Also, there are many brewers that they'll swear that they can taste the difference within batches of liquid yeast or first generation liquid yeast, second generation liquid yeast, second generation dry yeast. So the nuance in flavours that can come out of various different ways that you can use yeast are personal, and when you speak to brewers, actually really can make a huge difference.
So we're going to take a look now at the wider sort of category between ale and lager yeasts. Now, first off, ale yeasts, right, Rob? So please don't make me say the full Latin name again.
No, let's just say ale yeast, James.
Yep. Generally speaking, ale yeasts will ferment at the top of your wort, which is where we get things like Krausen, right? That lovely foamy cap that you can see on top of beer or wort whilst it's fermenting. Lots and lots of active yeast there. Prefers warmer temperatures.
Yeah, and generally because of those warmer temperatures, it's a much faster fermentation when you compare it to lager type yeasts. And it also can throw off some fruity flavours that can be desirable in some strains.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like a really classic kind of cask English best bitter or ESB with...
I could think about it right now.
I know, with all those lovely yeast-driven esters, you know, a little bit of sulphur, but tucked up in there, there's fruit, there's, you know, berries, that kind of stuff, and a lot of that is driven from the yeast. Now, in contrast, visually, lager yeasts, they ferment differently. Now, first and foremost, you may notice that there's more yeast at the bottom of your fermenter earlier with lager brewing. You don't get that foamy top on it.
Oh, I don't know, James. You still get Krausen on lager yeast. Yeah, and also they enjoy much colder temperatures. So we're looking at fermenting lagers between, say, 10 and 12 degrees. Obviously, because of that, they ferment slower, so the ferment takes longer.
Yeah, there are ways to speed that up through pressure fermentation. We're not going into that here. We've got loads of videos on that. Again, I'll put some links up here for you to check them out if you want to take a look at some of those hacks. Because of its longer fermentation period, cooler temperature, lagers generally, the yeasts produce cleaner, crisper profiles that really accentuate things like the malt character that's within that wort, right?
Yes, but they also have nuance within those flavors as well. There's many different types of what we call lager yeasts.
Yeah, and you can get very distinct differences between them. Some are drier than others, some are a little bit more fruity than others, but we are talking real subtlety here, aren't we? Okay, and then within both kind of these categories, there sits this, I don't want to say it's a middle ground, but it's a different sort of subsect of predominantly ale yeasts, and they're the sort of speciality strains. So things like saisons and some of the Belgian strains, right, which are characterized by their distinct flavors and aromas that they can produce. If we look at saisons, now saisons, classically lots of like peppery, clovey notes. Many yeasts that sit within the saison category as well are what we call diastatic positive. Now, that's an interesting one, isn't it, Rob, right?
Yeah, you can get saison yeast that are diastatic positive and saison yeast that are not. One of the things about a saison is many are really dry. Now, one of the methods of getting a bone dry saison is to use one of the saison yeast that is diastatic positive.
Yeah, because diastatic positive yeasts can consume the more complex sugars that other yeasts can't. So therefore, no matter what you do with your mash to try and leave lots of body in the beer, they're going to eat it, right? And they're wonderful to play around with, and if you want that classically bone dry saison, definitely give it a go, but you need to make sure that your cleaning regime is spot on, because you don't want that carrying over into your next beer, do you?
No, because what will happen is for your next series of beers that will come out afterwards, you'll find that they carry on fermenting. When they're packaged, they end up like the saison, bone dry and displaying these spicy, peppery kind of notes. They'll be really thin, they'll be overcarbonated, and really not what you want. So if you are using a diastatic positive yeast, just be super careful about your cleaning regime afterwards. And that's not just your brewing equipment, that's your packaging equipment as well.
Absolutely. Now, the other category we talked about there was the Belgian strains. Now, if you've tried Belgian beers, you know they'll be distinctive for those lovely sort of clovey, bubblegum, dark fruit kind of notes.
Banana.
Oh, yeah, banana, right? A Belgian wit with gorgeous amounts of like banana in there, sometimes citrusy, and much of that, again, that is driven by the yeast strains, right?
Almost all of it's driven by the yeast strains, those desirable flavors, clove, banana, as we've mentioned. Oh, Hefeweizen with that delicate balance between clove and banana is absolutely delicious. Yeast-driven flavors. Now
we're into funky territory, right? Because we want to take a quick look at wild yeasts, mixed fermentations, bacteria, bugs, that kind of stuff. Now, there is a whole like subset within the home brewing community that absolutely dine out on this stuff. But if you've ever tried those gorgeous, you know, sort of let's say, for example, some of the lambic kind of styles or goose kind of Belgian beers, the sours, mixed fermentations, they have that really distinct tartness, but balanced with things like almost farmyardy, horse blanket notes, right? And that's all being driven by those particular bugs and strains.
Yeah, I'm trying as hard as I can. I keep on trying every opportunity I can. I like it's commonly known as barnyard funk, and I think horse blanket was coined by one of the White Labs team, and it's kind of stayed. I don't know whether you can describe it as horse blanket, but it is a funky type flavour. it's not sour like lactic sour.
No.
It's a funk.
So what you're referring to there are the flavour characteristics and esters that are produced by Brettanomyces. That is a particular yeast strain, and it is a very old kind of yeast strain, and actually was probably, before people understood yeast, the most common strain of yeast that was doing a lot of fermentations. It is funky, it is earthy, it does have some tartness to it, but it is not like super sour, like Tangfastic Haribo sort of sour. That is driven by the lactic acid producing bacteria that we can add into our beer as well through the fermentation process.
We're also lucky enough to be able to have different versions, we can call it, different strains that are available that give you more or less of that funk. And actually this is where liquid yeast really shows its hand, because many of which just simply aren't available in a dry form.
If you want to have a play around with that, we did a brew a while ago with wonderful Mark Tranter from Burning Sky, who are absolutely famous here in the UK for producing some of the best mixed fermentation beers we've ever tried. Check that out again, link above Robert's head. There are a few things to note though. If you're making sour, funky beers, it's going to take a long time, right?
Yeah, you're playing the time game, and it's one of those things where you can take it as far as you want, and generally the longer you leave something, the more it will change. It's a really interesting experiment to do at home, where you can really keep on tasting every couple of weeks, every couple of months, and just seeing how that beer changes with what's going on with the sugars inside that are being consumed, but also the length of time it's in packaging, or the length of time it's in a oak barrel, for example, and how much oxygen is being in contact with the beer. That whole taste sensation that changes is an amazing experiment.
It is, and somewhat of a dark art as well, right?
Yeah, that I haven't got.
No. As with diastatic yeast, though, it's really important that your cleaning regime is spot on. For this kind of stuff, we would actually say having completely separate fermentation and packaging kit is a vital step, right? Because some of these things can be very difficult to get rid of after you've made your wort, or after you've fermented your wort rather. So yeah, just bear that in mind as well. Now there's another set of yeasts, isn't there, Rob, which we haven't touched on yet, that again sit within the sort of ale yeast category, but almost within their own little subcategory as well. What are they?
Kvike. So have their basis in Norwegian farmhouse brewing, actually. Obviously been around for centuries,
passed down through families and generations.
Yeah, and they can act very, very differently from what we had known as being ale yeasts.
Yeah.
So many of them, not all of them, and there are hundreds of different types. Some of them like to ferment at much, much higher temperatures, or will ferment at much, much higher temperatures. So whereas we're used to fermenting a beer at perhaps between 18 and 22 degrees normally, these yeasts will go up to 35, even higher degrees C, and produce some pretty interesting flavours, and those flavours can be a range.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the traditional sort of farmhouse strains that many of these commercially available strains came from were what we call multi-culture yeast strains. What's happened since they've been sort of commercially available is those individual strains within the multi-strain culture have been isolated and then propagated and become available for their particular characteristics, right? And that's leading to some super interesting yeast strains that are available that sit within Kvike, but they're not as complex and nuanced as the entire sort of multi-strain culture would be.
There's some, for example, that ferment absolutely super clean, and they'll do it at really high temperatures. Let's look at Lutra from Amiga Labs in the States.
Yeah, yeah.
Funnily enough, I was at a home brewing conference, and 6 lots of lagers had been produced from one lot of wort, a bit like your yeast experiment that you did a couple of weeks back. And it was a lager and 6 different yeasts. So we got to try all of them, and I could pull out which one was fermented with Lutra.
Yep.
But what I would say is it fermented the beer super quickly, and it wasn't quite as clean, and it did have a slightly nuanced flavour. But to produce that lager fast, that's the payoff.
Yeah.
It can do it.
Yeah, and it will turn around fermentation maybe in 24 to 72 hours, depending on the circumstances in the environment. And like you say, to do that so quickly from a commercial standpoint, that makes great business sense. But also as a home brewer, it's something that's really fun to play around with. I've made West Coast, IPAs and pale ales using those kind of yeast strains that are sort of really quick, thermotolerant, and literally you're grain to glass in like less than a week sometimes. It's crazy.
I always think that there is a payoff, time versus patience.
Yeah.
But it is available to do.
Yeah. Now there's a few popular Kveik's yeast strains out there, such as Voss or Horningdale. Try those out if you fancy having a play around with them. They'll produce different things in your finished beer. Can be great for some of the juicy sort of New England style beers.
There's another big bonus, James, and that's if you have not got fermentation temperature control and you want to brew in the middle of the summer, they are a really good choice.
Oh yeah.
Because they like those really high temperatures. They'll throw off some great flavours in the fermentation process, so it's a great time to experiment with them.
Now we're going to move on to pitching rates. Now pitching rates, basically it's the yeast manufacturer's advice on how much yeast you should be pitching. They'll generally describe it in the amount of cells per milliliter dependent on the gravity of the beer, won't they? That can feel a bit complex.
Yeah.
What's your advice for making that more simplified?
Right, actually, the other way that they express it is by how many grams per litre of wort that you're fermenting, and that's a much easier way of looking at it.
Now Rob, what if I underpitch my yeast? What's going to be the consequences there?
Okay, so the general term that brewers use is stressed yeast. And one thing that we generally don't want is stressed yeast, because normally what happens if the yeast becomes stressed is it throws off flavours that will be detectable in the final product. There are circumstances where actually that is desirable, but in most cases we don't want to stress the yeast out.
No, and you can end up with fermentation stalling. There's loads of things that can happen when you underpitch. So we'd always advise you pitch the right amount. Now, over pitching, on the other hand, that can be equally as bad, because you can end up with a beer that's bland. It's got less sort of ester development, especially in ales as well.
I would say though, it's very difficult for a home brewer to over pitch yeast. We are way more vulnerable to under pitching rather than over pitching.
Yeah. Now, as a loose guideline, most ale yeasts, generally you're pitching 0.5 to 1 grams per litre of wort that you have produced in most cases. Check the packet for details. And lagers, it's about double that. So again, just take a look at the packet of the yeast strain that you're thinking of buying. We've got all the details listed on our individual product pages about how much you need to pitch as well. So check that out before you check out actually the product that you... So when we talk about the topic of yeast, we've got a few top tips and some sort of things to just remind you of so that you don't make the same mistakes that actually we will have made over the years. Rob, what are your 2 top tips for yeast?
You need to make sure that you're checking your viability of your yeast if you're using liquid yeast especially. So when you receive that packet, you need to be looking at the best before date, making sure that it is as advertised. You need to keep that yeast in the fridge until the morning of brew day. Almost all of them want pitching at about the same temperature that you're going to ferment at, but check the packet, check the individual packet for the instructions.
And it's worth noting as well, a lot of them will have the manufactured on date as well.
Yeah.
And that is how you can actually work out how old that yeast is. And again, refer to their website to see whether you need to consider making a yeast starter or pitching more, maybe 2 packets.
Next up, I would be looking at fermentation temperature control. Now this will, if you're not doing it at the moment and you add that step in, you can do it using relatively simple equipment, or you can do it using super complex equipment. However you're going to do it, it will make a massive difference to your brewing to be able to brew any style of beer at any time of the year. It's awesome.
Martin and I covered that recently on a video where we asked the question, is fermentation, temperature controlled fermentation worth the fuss? You can check that video out again up here. We've also got videos on how to build your own fermentation chambers as well, so you can do it in a really cost effective way.
More tips, James?
Well, my one is just a reiteration of what we said earlier, cleaning regimes. If you're going to be using anything weird and wonderful, diastatic, or some of the weird and wonderful bugs, cleaning and sanitizing has to be on point. Now, we say it all the time, 90% of being a home brewer or a brewer is cleaning and sanitizing. This is a really good example of why it's so important. You don't want those cross contaminations, and believe me, if you end up with a diastatic yeast strain living in a fermenter, you are going to end up with beers for months that you will be sad about. My next one, dry yeast. Highly unlikely you're going to need to rehydrate them, okay? Check the packets again for any instructions that might tell you otherwise, but as far as we know, the majority of them these days, you do not need to rehydrate them. As Rob said earlier, actually it's far safer just to pitch the dry yeast rather than creating a rehydrated yeast starter kind of thing. So yeah, just make sure that you check the packet for the yeast you're going to be using.
And lastly from me, I would really suggest, if you've not done so, have a play around with the thermotolerant or Kvike strains. There's such a wide range of yeast that throw a multitude of different flavours. It's a really exciting thing to have a bit of play around, do your own research. It's a really exciting project.
On that, a similar thing, you mentioned earlier that a couple of weeks ago I did that video where I did a hazy pale, 3 different yeast strains. Conduct some of those kind of experiments yourself. You don't need to do it all at the same time like I did. You can literally brew one beer with one recipe and then switch the yeast for the next time you brew it. Save a couple of bottles if you can. Try them again side by side and just see the difference that switching out the yeast can make, because it is really good fun and they are nuanced. Even though they may all sound very similar on the packets and they'll do this and they'll do that, when you actually get to playing around with them and trying them side by side, you can have dramatically different beers.
Now, as always, we would like to hear your comments and thoughts. If you've tried a certain yeast strain and a certain style of beer and you've really enjoyed it, been really impressed with what's come out, equally, if you've been really unimpressed with what's come out, we'd really like to know.
So if you've made it to the end of the video, please do make sure that you hit the like button if you've enjoyed this. If you're not already, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. All those things really help us out. Now, my final point. Everybody that's watching these series of videos where we're talking about ingredients, they might be thinking that part 4, we're going to dive into water and minerals. Now, unfortunately, we're not. And the main reason for that is, well, 2 things. One, you don't want to watch 20 minutes of Rob just being asleep on the table, right?
Yeah, it's not my subject, James.
But we've also got already 2 amazing videos where we covered it in lots of detail. It's quite a complex topic. If you'd like to watch those, we had the wonderful Fraser from Middle Child Brewing with us. He's a master on the topic. There's a link up here. Check that out. And again, if you've got questions about that topic, drop some comments in that video and I'll come back to you.
I won't.
As ever, thanks for watching. Have a great brew.
Cheers.